Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our fourth ESG webinar for 2022. So in this webinar, we're looking at measuring, calculate your ESG maturity, and we hope you are warm wherever you are. You can see Ashley and I are struggling in the cold here in Melbourne, me more so than Ashley, but we are struggling.
I've got a puffer jacket on. I'm struggling too.
You never see Ashley in a puffer jacket, but it's just a vest. It's not a proper jacket, Ashley.
True.
So as always, the presenters, Ashley and I, and then this is the fourth in our ESG webinar series. Next month in July, we'll be looking at pulling it all together and delivering your ESG report. So we know a lot of clients are telling us they've got 30 June year ends. They've issued their financial statements end of September, end of October, and they want to, at that stage, have an inaugural ESG report. And therefore, we have to start to pull it all together around July. So we'll talk through that. And then in August, we talk about assurance over your ESG report. So that's our series. Ashley, I'll hand over to you to do a little bit of a recap. It's been a journey. We've done 3 sessions before, a bit of a recap, and then straight into webinar number 4.
Awesome. Thank you, Aletta. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So let's just go back over the last 3 that we've done, because you might remember part of one of the first webinar we did, we talked about a roadmap for ESG activation, and what the webinars are trying to do is work through that roadmap. So there's a bit of kind of compounded learning going on here. So let's just go back to webinar 1 and recap what we spoke about there. So that was about demystifying the process. So Aletta, are you on slides or am I on slides? You're on slides? Okay. So the first thing we talked about is what's the actual business problem here, or what's the business case. We started calling this a business problem. Now we actually call it a business opportunity. And you might remember what we talk about here is this is an access issue, right? So it's about access to capital, access to markets, customers, clients, and access to people, attracting and retaining good staff. And those that choose to make commitments in relation to ESG or sustainability position themselves better for opportunities in relation to capital, either the cost of capital, access to capital, particularly the cost of debt funding, we know is changing dramatically based on the ESG commitments and performance. They position themselves for better opportunities in relation to market access. That is, you'll be able to secure customer contracts or client contracts if you have a demonstrated ESG or sustainability commitment. More specifically, your risk increases of being locked out of revenue opportunities, being locked out of customer contracts if you can't demonstrate some kind of ESG or sustainability commitment going forward. And then attraction and retention of staff is obviously one of the big issues facing many organisations in Australia today. We're no different from that. And we know that employees and prospective employers are always asking about their employer's social license to operate. What are you doing to protect employees? What are you doing to protect clients and customers? What are you doing to protect the supply chain? What are you doing to protect communities more broadly? So that's the business opportunity. We talked about how, notwithstanding the myriad of issues that exist within the E, the S, and the G buckets, there's a lot of focus around net zero, or emissions reduction, CO2 emissions reduction. You might remember we talked about the kind of mitigation hierarchy. The best thing to do is to try and avoid emissions, then try and reduce emissions, then replace emissions, which is about renewables, and then offset where you can't do any of those other 3 things. We talked about other ESG factors outside of net zero. So what are the things that fall in the E bucket, what falls in the S bucket, what falls in the G bucket? And then we shared with you some examples of various ESG or sustainability reports that I suppose we've seen around the traps that we thought demonstrated some really positive ways to communicate some of the key messages in these spaces and some of the key activities that different organisations are engaging in. Then we shared with you our roadmap, which hopefully you now dream about at night because you've seen it in every webinar so far. And you might remember there's 6 stages in the roadmap, and we'll bring it up in a minute and we'll share that with you again. So that was webinar 1, demystifying the ESG process. Webinar 2 was all about frameworks and reporting. And so in webinar 2, we spoke about a few different things in that bucket. We talked about, again, in relation to that roadmap, we talked about the importance of doing a current state assessment. Very few organisations, when they start their ESG journey, are coming off a zero base. Most organisations already have things in place or have commitments or strategies that would otherwise fall into many of the buckets or the themes that they incorporate into their ESG strategy going forward. So the classic is you make a commitment around your people, you make a commitment around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and many organisations will already have some kind of DEI policy or strategy in place that they can point to as a starting point for their commitment in and around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And there are a myriad of examples like that in most organisations. In and around governance, most people will have corruption and bribery policies. Most people, those of you that hold an AFSL, you've clearly got anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing policies and procedures, and you report to AUSTRAC anyway. So you're already doing a lot of those things in and around governance and risk management. We talked about the fact that this has been driven by more stakeholders wanting more information. And so the demands are increasing upon an organisation to communicate what it's doing, not just in relation to its financial performance, but in relation to its performance more broadly. We then talk through some of the more common sustainability frameworks. You might remember some of these. I'm sure you've come into contact with many of them. We talked about Alette's favourite because of the pretty colours and the pretty pictures, the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 colourful boxes. We talked about some of the others, the Global Reporting Initiative, the World Economic Forum's 4 Pillars approach, the Value Reporting Foundation, the SASB standards, the TCFDs, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and we talked about the launch of the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, at COP26 last year by the world's leading accountants, the IFRS Foundation, who are responsible for setting many of the global accounting standards. And of course, I'm not an accountant, so Alette's going to correct me afterwards because I've got this wrong. But the international accounting standards setters decided that because they're incredibly good at setting standards for financial reporting, they're going to go and set standards for sustainability reporting. And so the ISSB is this big juggernaut going around the world, mopping up other frameworks. And to date, I think it's mopped up, or it's decided to incorporate the TCFD reporting requirements. It's mopped up the Value Reporting Foundation, the Sustainability Accounting Standards, a few of the others, GRI. And so what it's trying to do is normalise how you would report under a lot of these different frameworks and standards. So that was webinar 2. Aletta, I've obviously made grave mistakes in describing some of those as standards. Was there anything you wanted to correct me on before I move on to webinar 3?
Ashley, finally, you understand how an accountant's mind works, and you've got it all right.
and so the ISSB had released a couple of prototype standards earlier on this year, which were just general kind of reporting requirements, and then they'd released one in relation to climate as well. Those have turned into exposure drafts, and so there are now exposure drafts in circulation, and all of the world's accountants are now thinking about how to comment on those so that they'll be finalised sometime soon, and then we'll have a framework, an agreed framework, that is another framework that people can choose to report under as well. Okay. Webinar 3 then was all about stakeholder engagement and materiality assessments. So you might remember in this webinar, we talked about, there was a little bit of repetition, but we talked about the importance of identifying all those stakeholders. And remember, the thing that's driving all of this is that more stakeholders require more information about more issues now, more than ever before, and that's only increasing. And so that's what is driving all this. You might remember we shared with you our kind of stakeholder ecosystem, our wagon wheel of stakeholder groups. And because there are so many stakeholders that all organisations need to think about, the trick here is to assess not just the influence that many of those stakeholders can have over your organisation, but the interest they have in ESG issues as well. And you might remember we shared with you these kind of quadrants of stakeholders. You've got tier 1 stakeholders, high influence, high interest, tier 2 stakeholders, high influence, low interest, tier 3 stakeholders, high interest, low influence, tier 4 stakeholders, low interest, low influence. And we said, you know, in relation to each of these, it's important to think about what your engagement strategy is, because they have a different bearing on how you decide what you commit to when you develop your own commitments around ESG and sustainability. Aletta, yeah, for some reason they're coming in one at a time. That was probably some formatting issue from me months back. Apologies for that. So this was about deciding how to engage and triaging stakeholders and triaging issues. Then deciding what you wanted to talk to stakeholders about and asking them. And we shared with you some examples of surveys and some of the results that came back. And you might remember we showed you some kind of questions you could ask around E, questions you could ask around S, and questions you could ask around G, and how you would go about kind of processing those and what you might do with that information. After all of that, the final step in the stakeholder engagement process is then to link those issues that become important to your stakeholders, triaged appropriately for influence and interest, against those issues that are important to your business. And the issues that end up being important to your business and important to your stakeholders become the key priorities in your materiality assessment or your materiality matrix. And those are the things that should underpin the development of your sustainability commitments and your sustainability strategy going forward. What do you think, Aletta? Anything to add to that?
No, I think we're now to the favorite part, or my favorite part, and that is how do we get started? As you know, I like to start and do things. Ashley, are you talking through the ESG roadmap?
No, I think you are, Aletta.
Oh, okay. Fantastic, my favorite part. So we've suggested all along that we believe it's important that organizations make a start. A lot of people hear all this information and they find it really overwhelming. And we said, listen, let's just come up with a 5-step approach to issue your first sustainability report, your inaugural sustainability report. And we said it's number one to assess. So what is the current state of the things you're already doing? Look at all your existing policies, procedures, processes with an ESG lens on and say, okay, we're already doing some amazing things around diversity, around people engagement, around staff engagement, around modern slavery, etc. Let's just assess what we're currently doing. Then in number 2, let's look at a materiality assessment. Let's look at consulting with our stakeholders, and as Ashley explained, reach out to who are our stakeholders, reach out to them. Step 3 is now we, based on what we know we already do, based on what our stakeholders would like us to do, commit to some initiatives going forward, develop an ESG strategy. And then in phase 4 or step 4, we get to measure. So measure our ESG maturity and consider whether there are any gaps. And then in step 5, we start to prepare and finalize our sustainability report. So today, our 4th webinar, we're looking at that measure step 4. And next month, our 5th webinar, we look at the reporting side. And then obviously a really important part here, and I think the most important part, is the ongoing continuous improvement, which we've got as step 6, but it's actually just an ongoing process. At this stage, we're just focusing on helping clients to get started. Often the hardest thing is to just make a start, and therefore we're focusing on that. And we've said to you all along, we believe if you're going to issue your sustainability report with your audited financials in September, October, there's a bit of a process on what we should be doing. And we believe next month we get to the measurement part. And therefore today we want to give you some guidance around measurement, and obviously happy if you want to reach out to us to help you in greater detail. So if we look at determining the level of ESG maturity, Ashley, I'll throw back to you.
Thank you. So I suppose maybe it goes without saying, but it's if you're going to make commitments around ESG and sustainability, you've got to work out what it is you want to commit to, because you've got to take a view on what you want the organisation to be doing in the future. And one kind of framework through which that is to think about how heavily you want sustainability integrated into the business. So here's a kind of one way to characterize it, if it's helpful, an integration roadmap. And you can see here we've got kind of 5 stages. We've got activating, compliant, proactive, strategic, and purpose-driven. And what's interesting about this is there's 2 dimensions to this, right? There's an evolutionary dimension and there's kind of like a steady state dimension. So firstly, where do you want your organization to be in the future? Do you want your organization, and I'll talk about what each of these mean in a minute. Do you want your organization to ultimately be a proactive organization, or do you want your organization to ultimately be a purpose-driven organization? If you want to be purpose-driven, or if you want to be proactive, what will most likely happen is you will evolve over time to get there. So you'll probably move through each of these stages of evolution as you develop your ESG maturity. So this represents not just what your final position might be organizationally on ESG, it kind of represents the evolution of moving through it. So starting with activating, right? This is, for many businesses, this is where they are at the moment, right? They're looking to activate their sustainability agenda. They're considering risks, they're considering opportunities, and they're trying to work out how to package it all together. And many of them are probably trying to work out how to make a start, which is, I suppose, one of the things that's driving us to talk about many of the issues that we're talking about in these webinars. The next level in evolution is this whole idea of compliance-based. So you've got sustainability initiatives in place, and you're largely responding to regulatory or other stakeholder requirements. As we've already talked about many times before, in Australia, we have the luxury of not having any kind of government-imposed rule book on us yet. And so we're not necessarily responding to regulatory requirements, although our counterparts in the EU and the US and elsewhere around the world don't have that luxury. There are imposed regulatory frameworks already around many kind of sustainability reporting requirements elsewhere. Moving from compliant into proactive, this is where an organization starts to develop more of a systematic whole of business approach to sustainability, and they're thinking about it in the context of boosting value creation opportunities. It's not just a problem that we need to comply with, it's not just a risk management exercise, it's now an opportunity, right? And as we said before, we start to talk about this now as a business opportunity, not a business problem. Moving from proactive to strategic, you're now embedding sustainability across most parts of the business, perhaps focusing on circularity, but more about having a positive impact in the markets in which you operate. And then purpose-driven, maybe the ultimate state here, which is having sustainability embedded across all parts of the business, and you're using kind of ESG criteria beyond what's required by law to have some kind of positive impact in the value chain. And so, again, you need to decide where you want to be or how you're going to get there before you start to make specific measurements around certain commitments. So that's just kind of by way of background, that's an important step to move through. So in doing that, it's important then to not just identify what the future state is for your organization or that you want it to be, but also what the gaps are between the current state and the future state. So keeping this, and so in doing that, once you identify what the gaps are, it's then important to agree the initiatives that you need to put in place to try and cross those gaps. And they might be incremental initiatives. You might not be able to cross those maturity gaps in year one at all. In fact, it's unlikely that you would. So you make a commitment to net zero. Very few businesses are making commitments to net zero by 2023. Very few are doing it by 2025. Most are doing it by 2030. And so this is a 7 or 8 year plan for most organizations at the moment. And then, of course, we go into that really enjoyable stage of having to identify and collect the data so that we can actually report against each of these dimensions. So if we continue on that kind of framework that we started with, this kind of, and I should say, sorry, the one thing that wasn't in that framework is maybe even comes before activating, which is uncommitted, right? So these are organizations who are still unsure about whether they should do anything around sustainability or ESG. Now, that's not in the framework because in our experience, the number of organizations that are still uncommitted around this is dropping daily. And very shortly, this won't be an issue about should you commit, this will be an issue about when will you commit for everyone. So that's not in there. But taking those 5 levels, activating, compliant, proactive, strategic, and purpose-driven, you can start to think about specific dimensions within your business and how each of these might apply to specific dimensions. So take strategy, right? And I won't talk through each of these, but basically think about strategy, as three things. Think about what the rationale for sustainability commitments is in your business, and that's kind of this headline explanation for what each of these states is. Think about the approach that's required to get to each of those stages. How are you defining it? What's the strategy look like? Where does it sit? How broadly does it apply to the business? And what are the things that it covers? And then think about the kinds of commitments that you're likely to be wanting to make, or that you're likely to have to make to kind of satisfy each of these levels. And as you can see, they kind of increase in breadth and depth as you move through each of these kind of integration levels. Outside of strategy, then, the other thing to think about is disclosure elements. And so here you've got, if you think about having to communicate to a broader group of stakeholders, what you're having to do here is think about, okay, if we're going to be communicating, what are we going to be disclosing, right? What's our view on materiality? What are the metrics that we're collecting and reporting on? How are we reporting? What framework or frameworks are we going to be reporting against? And how heavily do we want to get the auditors involved? What level of assurance do we want to provide over these things? So again, you can see a ratcheting up of each of these particular issues, right? What's the role of materiality? Where do we draw the line? What do we include? What do we exclude? The classic one that you'll probably see at the moment is when organisations are reporting on their greenhouse gas emissions, they'll start with Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, and then and I think we've talked about what this all means, and then they'll creep into Scope 3 as required. Most organisations will report their travel emissions in Scope 3. What typically happens is, as organisations move through this, they start to include more and more in their Scope 3 emissions, and their desired end state is they can report on their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, and then full reporting eventually on Scope 3 emissions where material and where it's easily, or where it's able to be calculated. And so you can see here, the same thing applies across each of these kind of dimensions. And again, no need to go into a huge amount of detail, but it's important to think about practically what it means for your organisation as you start to think about where you sit in this level of maturity. The next thing to think about is what's actually required within the business to cross these gaps. And what we want to do here is not necessarily prescribe a series of steps that you should take. What we want to kind of leave you with here is a sense of who needs to be involved. And it's very unlikely that you can do all of these things without having involvement from most parts of your organisation. So if you think about it holistically, right, there's a role for leadership in this, and here we're talking about strategic oversight. We're talking about embedding ESG culture and behaviours across a business, and if you don't have leadership engaged in that, it's very hard to do. Right, if you think about legal risk and compliance, here we're talking about risk management, internal controls, classic things like employment law. What disclosures are you making on material risk? Heaven forbid, we might even need to get the sales team involved, because this is all about client engagement, understanding client expectations, and the front line of the business is the part of the business that probably knows that best. IT will necessarily be involved around data security, even around your waste management policies around IT hardware. Finance is involved, particularly for issues like wage compliance. The growing interest around ESG-linked remuneration for executives as well. The marketing and communications team, someone's got to craft the narrative around your ESG journey, and I don't mean that in a nefarious or duplicitous way. It's just a really important communications exercise, and it's important to have communications specialists involved in this. And if you have a look at some of the sustainability reports that are around today, they're awesome, right? They're really well written. The information's really well presented. They're easy to digest, and all that stuff just doesn't happen by accident. That involves a lot of people thinking really deeply and really clearly about how to communicate their key messages. HR team's going to be involved, of course, because employee engagement's a big issue. I mentioned diversity, equity, and inclusion before. Most organisations currently have something around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then operations will be involved too, because that deals with things like procurement, facilities management. I mentioned travel as a Scope 3 calculation as well. And so you can see it's very hard to take a holistic approach to sustainability commitments and sustainability reporting and data collection if you don't have all these parts of the business involved.
I think Ashley, what's interesting as well, when we start to measure and report, we have to measure activities and data at all aspects of the business. Some of this, it's measurement and reporting at a facility level. Some of it is around travel. Some of it is finance. Some of it is technology. Some of this information is sitting in HR. So for everybody to understand holistically what we're trying to achieve and why the data that they currently have should be made available and what is being looked for, it's a real big cultural shift throughout the organization in order to measure and capture the right data, in order to report ultimately, right? It doesn't happen overnight.
Absolutely, yeah.
So if we go on and we look at to identify and collect the data to a report against our chosen dimension or our chosen framework, I think what's important to know is there's so much talk about ESG and sustainability reporting. And I think what's really important that this is all about progress and continuous improvement. I always tell the story that my children, my twins, when they were in prep, they came home with, Mum, it's not practice makes perfect, it's practice makes progress. And I always think about that when I think about ESG. This is about progress. We're not going to start necessarily with the most amazing ESG sustainability report, but we're going to make a start, and our focus is going to be how do we shift the dial and how do we make progress? How do we improve all of this? When you look at ESG and sustainability reporting, the other thing to remember is there's really two aspects here. There's the aspect where we do external reporting to our stakeholders. You'll remember we've done our stakeholder engagement. We know what our stakeholders are interested, what they care about, what reporting they want to receive. So yes, a big part of what we do is reporting to them, and that will happen usually once a year. But the other side that I've put there is the internal reporting to management. And actually, Ashley, the slide that you've had on all the different parts of the business that have to be involved, it's kind of reporting to them as well as management, as well as leadership, so they can see how they are tracking on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. Because we do not want to get to the end of the year and prepare a report for stakeholders and suddenly realize, oh dear, we're very far off what we committed to or what we've tried to achieve. It would be better to have a continuous tracking, so there could be corrective action during the year. So I think that's really important. So there's two parts of reporting. Usually we just focus on external reporting and frameworks to use, but I want to put on the table today that internal reporting, because if we want progress, people who are responsible for progress need to be able to look at the data in a sensible way. But I'll come back to that. If we start with the external reporting to shareholders aspect, again, a lot of talk about ESG reporting. You could have ESG reporting as part of your published, audited financial statements. And I know there's some suggestions, recommendations by the AASB in a recent position paper, even by ASIC, that they would like to see TCFD disclosures. At this stage, they're not saying where it should be. It could be in the operating and financial review. It could be in the management commentary that goes with the financials, or it could even be in the financial statements. But one option is to have all of this, all the ESG reporting in published financial statements. I think you have to remember, as soon as it goes into published financial statements, it would be subject to audit. If it's outside these published financial statements, somewhere else in the annual report, your auditor will have a responsibility to read it and make sure it's not inconsistent with information in the published audited financials, but it itself will not be subject to detailed audit. So it's a high-level consistency issue. The other place where you could put your ESG reporting on an annual basis to your stakeholders is an independent sustainability report. Or I would imagine you can have a combination of the two. I believe a combination of the two is the answer, because you would say, here's my audited financial statements, and at the same day on the website, if that's how you publish your documents, we also have an independent sustainability report focusing on ESG. Now, if you publish a glossy, an annual report, you could have your audited financial statements in there, as well as usually there's a chairman's report, there's a CEO report, there could be an independent sustainability report in that same glossy. So it's really two documents sitting next to each other. And as I've said, I think right at the start of the whole series, I believe in holistic, integrated reporting. Therefore, for these documents to speak to each other, sit next to each other. The good thing about keeping this sustainability report separate from audited financials is you still can decide at this stage whether you want assurance over it or not. And if you want assurance, it could potentially just be limited assurance, especially in the early days when we get going. So just, where do we report when we report externally to stakeholders? I think it will be confusing. Personally, I think it will be confusing if we publish audited financial statements at a particular date and we only publish sustainability reports, 6 months later, etc. I think stakeholders would expect integrated, holistic communication more or less at the same date and at the same time to get a view on an organization. So that's the two options. If we look at TCFD, we get a lot of questions at the moment about TCFD. So TCFD is our task force on climate-related financial disclosures. So interesting things just in the name. It's only focusing on climate disclosures, which is one of a lot of ESG factors out there. And it's only looking at financial disclosures around climate, so not non-financial disclosures. So it's quite a narrow set of disclosures. And due to the focus on financial disclosures, there's often that requirement to have this go together with financial statements again. Interestingly, if you look at the type of disclosures we have in here, it's a high-level governance. Disclose the governance around climate-related risks and opportunities. Actually, I like to see the word opportunities there as well. So what is your governance around this at a holistic level? Then strategically, please disclose your actual and potential impacts of these climate-related risks. On a risk management level, disclose how you as an organization identify, assess, and manage climate-related risks. So what is your process to identify and assess it? What are your processes to manage a climate-related risk? And then finally, it comes down to measurement. So disclose the metrics, the targets that you use to manage this. So I just want to say again, TCFDs, as amazing as they are, it's only looking at climate and it's only looking at financial disclosures. And we believe, and we've said this all along, that ESG is more than just climate. And even if you look at the environment side, it's more than just climate. And then obviously there's all the amazing things around social and governance as well. Now, TCFDs, the other thing I should mention, TCFDs are currently recommended by ASIC and by the Australian Accounting Standards Board. But please also note that these TCFDs have been embedded in the standards that are being issued by the International Sustainability Standards Board. Ashley talked about the 2 prototype standards which became exposure drafts, which we expect to become standards very soon. And the first two standards were, one, a general standard to catch all. Then the second standard was climate-related risks. So they've already started by embedding the TCFDs in the international sustainability standards. And next standards will address the other E, S, and G metrics. And just another point to note. So one would imagine that in future, the recommendations will be to comply with the International Sustainability Standards Board. Interestingly, when the International Sustainability Standards Board issued their very first standard, it was titled General Requirements for Disclosure of Sustainability-Related Financial Information. So it's a general approach, a kind of a catch-all. So they're saying if we don't currently have a standard on diversity, equity, and inclusion, it doesn't mean you don't have to disclose it, because the general requirements will capture everything, right? That's the one thing to note. The second thing is they still focus quite narrowly on financial information at the International Sustainability Standards Board. And, their focus is quite narrowly on investors and financiers. And as we've said, there are a lot more stakeholders interested in information about an organization. And therefore, some of the feedback that we've already given is, surely we should look at all the information needs of all the stakeholders, not just financial information needs of investors and financiers. Anyway, that is just interesting to note. The other thing that we've got, I've put an extract of that general standard, and it's told in paragraph 11. It says you have to, in general, the core principle is you have to provide disclosures, again, around governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. So this is exactly what we currently have in the TCFDs, but it only applied to climate risk. Here they're saying, in general, if certain item is a risk for your business or an opportunity for your business, we would like you to disclose the governance processes around that, the strategy or your approach to managing the risk and opportunities, your risk management, and your metrics and targets. All right, so it's making it very broad and very general. Then they further say in paragraph 29, an entity shall identify metrics that apply to its activities in line with its business model and in relation to specific sustainability-related risks or opportunities. By the way, I love the fact that the standard setter is talking about risks and opportunities. Usually in accounting standards, it's only about risks. So here it's risks and opportunities, and we see the language throughout. And what they're also saying here is we cannot prescribe to you exactly what the metrics are, because every organization has specific activities and strategies, and therefore you have to identify the metrics that make sense. So some people feel uncomfortable about this because they would say, please give me a list of things I have to disclose and I can just go and do it. This standard is saying, hang on, you have to look at your business model and your activities and come up with fit for purpose metrics, which would lead to fit for purpose disclosure. Because if the ultimate goal is to communicate with our stakeholders, it has to be fit for purpose. All right, it cannot just be a boilerplate list of disclosures. Others prefer a boilerplate because they see it as more comparable information, but it's not always telling the true story about an organization. As you can hear, I don't like boilerplate disclosures in accounting or in ESG. They further go on and say in paragraph 31, when a metric has been developed by an entity, remember this is now a fit for purpose metric based on your business model, you have to disclose, and this is important, how the metric is defined, because everybody can define the metric slightly differently, including whether it's an absolute measure or have you expressed it in relation to another metric, so in relation to revenue, in relation to floor space, and then also any sources that have been used to construct the metric. So where did you get the data from? The second thing is whether measurement of the metric is validated by an external body, and if so, which body? So if there's a body that gives us guidance on how to measure carbon footprint, whether we've complied with those measurements, that's to get some level of comparability. And then thirdly, explanations of the methods used to calculate the targets and the inputs to the calculation, including significant assumptions made and the limitation of those methods. So if we start to make significant assumptions, to do calculations, to disclose to stakeholders, we should tell them what we've assumed. So if they've got a different view on our assumptions, they can back it out, they can adjust it, etc. Very similar to what we see around disclosures in financial statements. If you have to make a disclosure around how did you determine fair value, of an asset, how did you determine impairment, etc. If you've made assumptions, you disclose that. So the user knows that. So again, what's your business model? What is a fit for purpose metric? What makes sense for your business? And therefore also, how did you do it? So it can't just be a black box and nobody knows what happens in there. So really important to communicate all of this. If you look at your reporting to your stakeholders in your annual report, so this is, please note here, there's a little bit of language we have to understand. An annual report is the glossy that incorporates a lot of different pieces of information. So in an annual report, there could be a chairman's report, there could be an operating financial review, and there could be audited financials in there as well. So often what we see when organizations report to stakeholders, it's in that broad annual report or it's on the website, but it's not in that audited financials. And often it is nice one-page overview performance at a glance. Ashley, I know this is an example that you've picked up. Did you want to talk through maybe the components? I love it in its simplicity. And then obviously it's backed up by more detailed disclosures on how they got to these numbers.
Sure. And this is just by way of example, right? So this is the Cleanaway Sustainability Report, which, Cleanaway has a great story to tell because they're in the business of waste management. This is just one page in their report, and so they talk about their performance at a glance, which is not necessarily an ESG metric of any sort, but it just gives you a sense of their operations. But then it very clearly sets out some really important commitments and really important targets for them in relation to people and culture. And so they've got engagement scores, they've got response rates to engagement scores, and they've got some diversity and equity metrics there around gender. They have some of the more common statistics in relation to health and safety, total recordable injury frequency rates, which you'll see most organisations record. But importantly, then they also just very quickly set out some of the data around their community investments. Okay, so this box on the right-hand side is really all around the S bucket in E, S, and G, right? So this is about how we engage with our people, how we keep them safe, how we engage with our communities. Now, there are other things that sit outside of that. So there's things in E and things in G that they need to report on. And there's a lot more detail and a lot more qualitative information around this in the detail of the sustainability report, but this is just one example of a snapshot that you'll see in many reports. There's another one after this, which again is one of my favorites. I think the Charter Hall Sustainability Report is great for anyone who wants to read a nice report. This is a good one. I really like the way they set out things. So this is just some of their achievements in relation to E. There's a table on S and a table on G as well. But what I really like about this is they clearly set out what their commitments relate to, what the themes are they're committing to. They clearly set out what their achievements were in FY21, both qualitative and quantitative. Here there's a lot of quantitative information, which is very useful. They clearly talk about what their target is in FY22, and then they also include a medium to long-term target as well. Again, if you go into their report, there's a lot more detail. Each of these lines is then laid out on subsequent pages with a lot more information around it. But what I like about these types of tables at the front of many of these sustainability reports is just how easily and how clearly they communicate some of the key metrics and some of their key achievements to readers of those reports. This is now really just thinking about, well, what are the, if you're thinking about measuring, what are some of the things that you can measure, right? And so this is not a definitive list by any stretch of the imagination, but hopefully it gives you some indication of what, and the reason these are included is these are some of the common things that we see measured by different organisations, again, in different sectors, but starting with E, because this is probably the most prolific, and you'll see, it's very unlikely you'll see a sustainability communication to stakeholders, so a sustainability report to the public that doesn't talk about an organisation's carbon footprint, right? And obviously what people are measuring here is their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. Sometimes they're measuring their scope 3 emissions. Typically it's around transport, and so, you know, how many flights are we taking a year, and can we do anything about that? Or, you know, how much carbon is being consumed by our employees on their way to work? And can we make them all jump on electric scooters or something like that? And then often you'll see commitments in and around renewables, right? So how much are we installing on site? So how many panels are we putting on roofs? Not often people are putting wind farms on their roofs, mainly just panels on their roofs. And how much purchased renewable electricity are we bringing to the business as well? Around energy efficiency, you'll often see people looking at neighbours' energy ratings. That's where you rate the energy efficiency of the building. That's a standard that most people comply with. Neighbours also has water efficiency as well, and then just overall efficiency of the buildings. People will often report efficiency-related capex, so where they're spending money to generate efficiency gains. That'll often come out in these things as well. And then in relation to waste management, you'll often see calculations around landfill, or more importantly, what are we diverting from landfill? Is it going into waste to energy systems or elsewhere? You'll often see people reporting the amount of material that they recycle or the amount of material they reuse. And for organisations where it matters, you'll often see data around single-use plastics. Happens a lot in retail, particularly where packaging involves or used to involve single-use plastics. Doesn't happen so much anymore. So there's some of the common things that you might think about measuring in relation to E. Moving on to S, there's also some commonalities here as well. There's 5 buckets here: health and safety, employee engagement, customer satisfaction, diversity and equity and inclusion, and community support and engagement. I've already talked about employee engagement. That was in the Cleanaway high-level metrics. Health and safety, here are some other things you'll see. You'll see lost time injury rates and lost time injury frequency rates, all of which is part of WorkSafe reporting. Customer satisfaction, you'll often see net promoter scores, or you'll see, like, organisations are making commitments to energy efficiency capex. You'll see commitments to specific client improvement initiatives. In diversity, equity, inclusion, there's a lot of great reporting that happens here because there's a lot of indexes and ratings agencies, but you'll often see organisations report on gender. So whether it's headcount, that is overall headcount, or management roles, you might also see remuneration ratios as well. A lot of people talk about the Workplace Gender Equality Agency ratings and citations. There's a lot of, or sometimes you'll see things about the Australian Workplace Equality Index in relation to LGBTI inclusion, and then also we're starting to see more around disability and disability inclusion. So, you know, are you a member of the Australian Network on Disability? If so, what kind of citation are you getting from there? Community support and engagement, you'll often see things around donations, and so how much time are we providing to support the community? How much money are we providing to support the community? If we have premises, are we making any of our premises available to support community groups? And if we have skills, so not just putting bodies in place to do untrained work, which often volunteers do. This is about, if you're an organisation that has a particular skill, can you deploy that skill for the benefit of the community? So we're in the business of, amongst other things, financial literacy and financial education. Can we deploy that skill into the community to help as well? And typically, you'll see something around First Nations commitment as well. On to governance, again, some key things here. Often you'll see things around board composition, typically age, gender, tenure. I've put background in there because in the US, they typically like to report on whether you're white, Asian, Hispanic, or other. We don't see that much in Australia, which for whatever reason, it's odd, but you'll see some US-based sustainability reports that have that in there. Business ethics and compliance. Typically, organisations will talk about breaches or any fines they've got, or they should. They'll also talk about training rates around risk management, around codes of conduct. In data protection, you'll often see things around training rates for privacy, and you'll see things around ISO certification for cyber frameworks and cyber programs. Under governance and risk management, they'll clearly state where the ESG committee is, where it sits, who's on it, what it does, that kind of thing. And often you'll start to see more around executive remuneration and whether it's linked to ESG performance or not. Modern slavery, you can have supplier risk rating tools that procurement teams can use to try and manage risk around this. And then you might see stats on grievance processes that organisations have in place here, frequency rates, outcomes, things like that. So that's just a snapshot of the types of things that are being measured regularly by organisations reporting on their sustainability commitments and outcomes. And they may serve as a basis for the things that you might like to report on once you've done your stakeholder engagement process and once you've worked out what issues are important to your stakeholders and what issues are important to you as a business.
Thank you very much, Ashley. So from an external reporting perspective, as we've discussed in previous webinars, there are so many frameworks, more than 500 frameworks available. But what we are seeing in practice that often, irrespective of the framework, there are similar themes coming through sustainability reports in Australia. And it's not necessarily a requirement to, at this stage, commit to a particular framework. If you can look at the key themes, that would be good. Disclose the information you have across the key themes and maybe wait and see before you commit to a particular framework because there's some development and some movement going on. As I said, TCFDs used to be very popular, but now it's part of the ISSBs, United Nations, sustainability development goals, again, very popular. I love the goals, but there's no specific disclosure requirements associated with it. But at least look at the themes that your stakeholders are interested in. It's voluntary disclosure at the moment. There's no assurance required at the moment, but maybe back to the beginning, and that is just make a start and monitor where you want to go going forward. Also, I think the internal reporting to management or those charged with governance in the organization is important because it enables us to track where we're at and enable us to monitor where we want to go. Are we making progress so we don't get a surprise at the end of the year? So what we're seeing in this measuring and monitoring progress is the need for management to potentially have dashboards. So on the left-hand side, I've given you a basic Excel. Listen, we're looking at the difference between our number of male and female staff. This is what we had last year. This is our current, let's say, to-date number, and this is our target. In Excel, it doesn't look that informative. However, if you put it on a dashboard, present it slightly differently, you can look at gender diversity and very quickly see last year compared to the current year, compared to the target, are we making progress? Another way to look at it is an organization could say we have a target or we have a certain minimum that we don't want to fall below. As soon as we get close to that minimum, maybe there's some kind of red flag or alert that goes up to HR. Hang on, we said we don't want to fall below 30 of our employees being female. With recent staff changes, we're sitting at 32%. Be careful, we're nearing a certain a baseline that we don't want to go below. So I think it will be important if organizations have some clarity, come back to what are your stakeholders looking at, therefore what you commit to, what will we therefore report to stakeholders, what data will we have to capture internally in order to do that reporting, and how do we make that data accessible for the people responsible to achieve change. So it's kind of a working back stakeholders to annual reporting, to what do we need to measure and report to management, and how do we do that in a sensible way so it's easy to access. I would imagine if I'm a leader of an organization and gender diversity is something that's critical, if I could go to a dashboard and have access to where's our gender diversity across different levels at the moment today, and I can see it easily, that would make a lot of sense. So I can monitor it. So when we get to the annual report, it's all covered. So finally, I want to give you some information if you need assistance. First of all, I know in Australia the TCFD disclosures encouraged by ASIC, encouraged by the Australian Accounting Standards Board, BDO has developed free online training, and I've given you a link to the training and a little bit of a snapshot of what it looks like. You can start the course and work through the TCFD requirements to get an idea what it's about and how you can implement it in your organization, especially if you want to look at TCFD disclosures for 30 June 2022. So it's on our website, it's for free. Then also we've got monthly corporate reporting insights and newsletter that go out to a lot of our clients, but it goes out to anybody who wants to register for these publications. We also have some videos doing a bit of an overview what's covered, and there's always a number of articles, more and more articles around sustainability, so please have a look at that. Also on our website, we have a number of resources available, articles we've written, videos we've previously done, etc. And on our website, you can also see our key contacts in our business. So just recently, Brett Spicer have joined us in Brisbane. So you can reach out to any of these individuals to help you with ESG, sustainability, and the whole journey. So please feel free to contact any of us. You can see Ashley and I are in there as well. Brett is our latest addition to the team. Sharif, Catherine are based in Perth, for those of you attending from Perth. Brett, Dylan, and Cherie are based in Brisbane, as well as Mark Cushing. Josh Carver, based in Adelaide. Phil Murdoch is also based in Perth. He's an audit partner. And then we've got Catherine and Ian based in Sydney, and Ashley and I are based in Melbourne. But this for us at BDO is a national approach. Therefore, you're very welcome to reach out to any of us to see how we can assist you around ESG and sustainability. All right, so thank you very much for joining us today. We really appreciate the time that you've taken to join us. We hope you can join us again next month, where we talk about pulling it all together to prepare your sustainability report. Ashley, thank you very much, and I hope you all have a great weekend. In Melbourne, it's a long weekend. Very exciting.
Thanks, Aletta.